The de facto champions of the wilderness, the individuals who ride out in service to the forest, the mountain, the dale, and all creatures in between. They are woodsmen, warriors, and champions of the wilds. But the truth is, you deserve a better ranger. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Desks and Dorks. I am Kyle, I am the Dork. We bring you indie tabletop role-playing game content, and this is part of our ongoing series looking at the historical origins of some of our favorite character archetypes and how to improve them. Now usually, this is the part of the show where I tell you to go back to Patreon. Go look at the other stuff, right? However, we're going to tell you that in a little bit, but we got a sponsor for this video. Tales from Elsewhere. That's right. It's the most ambitious crossover since Marvel's Infinity War. But Tales from Elsewhere reached out to us about helping to promote their new RPG, Tales from Elsewhere Clockworld, which is a lovely post-apocalyptic Weird West action horror role-playing game, which are all things that I absolutely love and adore, but it features an awesome, really unique injury system with things called called shots, which is Wild West as hell. There's also all kinds of incredible different character archetypes, things like the Preacher, and my personal favorite, look at all of the monsters. Look at how sweet this looks. I'll be real with y'all. You guys know how this works for me. If I don't like the game, if nobody shows me the goods, I don't talk about it on the channel. Before you take a look at this Patreon, I need you to know, we're going back to this. Look at this. Look how hard this is. This is awesome. I'm going to be completely real with you. Part of the sponsorship money is just going right back to Peter because I'm back in the game. But the quick start rules are available on their website, and the link to sign up for the Kickstarter, which will start September 2nd, 2025, is live now and is in the description of this video. So if you're interested in a unique injury system, some great Wild West flavor baked into those rules, some fantastic monsters, incredible production value, go get signed up for this. That's probably what I'm going to do after I record this video, other than me make a custom image of me and Peter shaking hands like the statues from New Vegas after we started the recording for this, because let's be real, if I can't have fun, what am I doing here? Alright, with that out of the way though, please make sure you check this out, and if you're in the mood for some other indie role-playing content, you can check out our Patreon, where for $3 a month, you get your name in the credits. For $10 a month, you get a unique role-playing game that you can't buy anywhere else. We make it special for the patrons every single month. If you want digital copies of anything that Desks and Dorks has made, you can get them at itch.io. That QR code will take you there. And if you like physical stuff, you can go to Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and Exalted Funeral. Those are our distribution partners. Now, what are we going to discuss? We're going to talk about the Ranger, the origins of this hardy yeoman with this wonderful woodsman. We're going to talk about how different societies approach bushcraft and ranger archetypes in general, and then of course how to make them a part of our games. Now, the first thing we have to address is that hunting in general is pretty core to the ranger's identity, right? The idea of going out into the wilderness and battling animals is core to this character archetype. However, hunting and gathering, but specifically hunting for our purposes, and the relationship that that has with predatory animals is something that is incredibly common and has been since, the Neolithic era. This does not make every single one of these people rangers, because these are hunters and gatherers, yes, but I would argue that not all hunters are rangers, but all rangers are hunters. More on that in a second. But in order for us to really think about this, let's establish what is core to the idea of a ranger. Again, put that idea of hunting in your back pocket, your mental brain space for a second. Let's talk about what makes a ranger. First and foremost, ranged combat, but specifically a bow and arrow. 2, a proclivity to the wild, for the wild and the natural world. And finally, hit and run style tactics, or at the very least, tactics emphasizing mobility rather than strength. Now, other archetypes would later get glommed onto the ranger, things like the Beastmaster, for example, having animal companions. This is something that happens both in stuff like Dungeons & Dragons, but also popular games like World of Warcraft or Champions of Norath. So again, important, but I think these three core concepts are critical if we're going to be talking about the ranger as an archetype in all of fantasy RPGs. And it probably starts with one person. Let's be real here for a second. When we conjure up the image of a fantasy ranger, most of us probably picture Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Prince of Gondor, and again, future King of Gondor. At least if you're me, you probably picture the great Viggo Mortensen's portrayal of this character, but you might conjure up the animated one as well. And there's a lot of reasons for this, right? Tolkien and his impact on the fantasy genre is massive. However, it's important for us to take into account that the creators of role-playing games that happened in the 70s, 80s, and 60s weren't just taking inspiration from Aragorn and from Tolkien. They were also taking inspiration from some fantastic fantasy authors as well. For example, you might like C.S. Lewis, or perhaps R.E. Howard of Conan the Barbarian fame, who looks kind of like great value Dick Tracy, if I'm being completely and totally honest. Like, if this guy, had an office, I imagine he would compliment dames on the length of their legs and how he just was not expecting to see them on this dark and stormy night. He is kind of jacked, though, in his younger years, so good for you, R.E. Howard. Glad to see you hit the gym a little bit there, brother. But of course, there are other more esoteric authors as well. Charles Williams, by the way, would have been one of Tolkien's contemporaries. A very, very intriguing take on fantasy, a more philosophical take on fantasy. Look at this man. This man has stared into the horrors of the void, and the void stared back. That guy looks like he's seen horrors beyond mortal comprehension. And perhaps one of the most interesting of these is E.R. Edison, who sort of fused a lot of sci-fi elements into their fantasy as well. Their most famous book being The War of Ouroboros. All of these authors, however, including Tolkien, have one very, very big commonality, and that is that they are drawing on the Middle Ages. That's right, baby! We're going back to the Middle Ages, back to my bread and butter, because all of these fantasy authors would have been drawing on an idea of the archer, the ranger, the wild man performing his bushcraft that was pretty common in the Middle Ages. And that, I think, is where we get to start our journey about hunting. You see, hunting takes on a really important part because survival during the Middle Ages was not guaranteed. During the time of the Roman Empire, there you go, there's your free bingo space. Desks and Dorks mentioned the fall of the Roman Empire, but during the fall of the Roman Empire, one of the big issues was a total and complete collapse of bureaucratic systems. You might think that doesn't matter very much, but those bureaucratic systems allowed for the formation of larger cities. It makes sense for someone who wants to be a painter in a larger city because, again, they don't have to worry about losing their life or not being able to feed themselves because there's not people around to assist with those tasks. Those things mattered, and Rome's bureaucratic systems kept individuals of all types of crafts alive and well. After the fall of the Roman Empire, larger cities basically fall by the wayside for a while. Even small kingdoms, if you want to call them that, were dwarfed in size by the old empire. And again, this meant that people were required to be generalists rather than specialists. It wasn't a matter of convenience, it was a matter of making sure that you lived to see the next sunrise. And of those individuals who had to take advantage of the loss of those bureaucratic systems were hunters and gatherers in the traditional sense, particularly hunters. This crops up a lot in what would be medieval Ireland and medieval Wales, but it also happens in England and France as well. Individuals who were accustomed to or had an understanding of the wilderness areas around them and the place they were born were far more capable of fending for themselves and using the skills and their knowledge of the terrain to provide a life for themselves and their families. Subsistence hunting, as we would call it, is a way of survival. This differs a little bit from the earlier Neolithic ones because, again, over time, those people fell into a more specialized role as civilization rebuilt itself post-fall of Rome, and by civilization, I mean civilization as you and I understand it now. Those individuals who had been hunters before passed those skills on to their descendants. Essentially, what you have is a almost master-apprentice relationship as woodsmen grow in skill and ability throughout those times. And as it so often happens, the ability to survive becomes a ability to fight and take the battle to the enemy. The longbowman, as we understand them, falls into a really interesting place in the medieval system. And this goes back to how the medieval unit, the medieval kingdom, the medieval ruler would fight. We think about larger, more impactful armies, like big ones like the Battle of Agincourt, but for a lot of early Middle Ages, you're dealing with smaller war bands, essentially. And so if you have a fief or a small kingdom, an area, and you know there are experienced archers that you would recruit to your war band, that would give you a distinct advantage. Eventually, those archers would be codified and later trained as mercenary corps. And we know, by the way, that there are mercenary corps of archers, eventually those descended from basically hunting traditions in their own native countries, that were in incredibly high demand, reaching up to the 13 and 1400s. This is a really big deal because it means that knowledge of the wilderness, bushcraft, survival started as essentially folk traditions being passed down from one individual, a parent, onto a child, and then were later codified and turned into highly marketable military skills and abilities, particularly in places like Wales. The Welsh, who had fought many battles against the English, usually engaged in hit-and-run style tactics with hunting bows that were adapted for battle. Eventually, when Wales was subsumed into England proper, the Welsh longbowman was a highly sought-after mercenary unit, and I just want you to take a look at some of the hills and forests that you find in modern Wales today. Don't these look like and smack of the kind of mystery and fantasy that one would see in a tabletop role-playing game? And indeed, by the way, Robin Hood, who I would argue is another one of the most famous quote-unquote rangers in literature, is based on the legend of the Welsh longbowman. There is some apocryphal accounts that Robin of Locksley might not have been of Locksley, but may have been a pseudonym given to a Welsh tournament archer. Again, that's apocryphal. We don't know if that's true or not. And the idea that Robin Hood is a real person is a dubious claim at best, but it's really compelling and interesting to see that over time, what would have been an important folk tradition, right, passing on the skills of bushcraft and hunting to a loved one to allow for your community's greater survival and your greater survival, later becomes a method and mechanism of defense that is later turned into a kind of military unit that makes you highly desirable to conquerors and fighters. And again, the kind of hit and run style tactics that the Rangers really like in fantasy RPGs are exactly the kinds of techniques that the Welsh longbowmen used to fight against English invaders. It's pretty interesting. Another one of these, by the way, is Robert Louis Stevenson's fantastic The Black Arrow, which takes on a more intriguing role of the archer or the ranger in a later sense. The idea is that this is a guy who comes back from the War of the Roses, so we're into the Renaissance at this point in time rather than the Middle Ages, but the longbow still plays an important role there. I couldn't find a whole lot of connections about this, but The Black Arrow is a story of revenge, true revenge. And I'm not entirely plausible, or not entirely sure about this, but it's plausible that maybe the idea of a favored enemy could potentially come from revenge stories like this one. Again, based on this sort of archer tradition. So it's not just Aragorn that these people are sort of taking the archer tradition on. The fantasy authors that would pave the way and inspire people like Gary Gygax, but would also inspire everybody who was making, tabletop role-playing games and tabletop war games in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. They were all borrowing from a tradition of archers as soldier, archer as warband, archer as survivor, and eventually the archer as the ranger, as we would come to know them today. It's based on that historical tradition, and it's a pretty rich and evocative one, I think, in my own personal opinion. Now, again, despite the fact that Rangers did play a massive role in warfare, they played roles as well in other times, and I think it's important for us to discuss this because the idea of a ranger can be adapted and co-opted. It's one of the things that I think is the strongest part about the character class, as long as you combined a love of ranged combat, a reliance on hit and run style tactics, and an importance and appreciation of the natural world. You can make the argument that a lot of people could be, potentially, a ranger. So let's look at a couple of those potential rangers in other times. One of them that comes up is the frontiersman. This was another one that did inspire a lot of people making role-playing games in the United States during the 70s and 80s. Particularly when we think of the frontiersman, people oftentimes think of Daniel Boone. However, Daniel would not have been the most common one. The most common frontiersmen, for those of you who are not up on your early colonial American history, were the Scots-Irish, who began up north in the east and eventually made their way down south, pushing into the Carolinas and exploring from there. It's part of the reason that there is some serious like Scottish and Irish heritage and heritage-like events in the American South. It's largely because of those individuals. And again, this makes sense, right? A love of the native wilderness, a reliance on ranged weapons, and an understanding of the importance and the effectiveness of hit and run style tactics, particularly if you're wearing a red coat. I will, however, caution a lot of the American frontiersmen that we potentially idolize did engage in some less than savory practices against the natives, who also, by the way, I think could make for compelling rangers if that is something that you're looking for. However, there are two particularly interesting ones that I want to draw our attention to. I'll talk about the one on the left in a second. The one on the right is the German Jaeger, or essentially a light infantry scouting unit that would have taken on a role during the Prussian military conflicts and eventually into modern German military history. But Jaeger literally means hunter, and the first Jaegers who fought with those kinds of muskets were not formal military soldiers. They were in fact hunters taken from the populace who, because of their already incredible skill at bushcraft and their understanding of the natural wilderness and their proficiency with the musket as a hunting weapon, were drafted into early German conflicts. Eventually, much like the archers they were emulating, the Jaegers were formalized and codified into an actual military unit. So not only does the cycle of ranger happen in the Middle Ages, but humanity, having forgotten that kind of cycle, just repeats the cycle again during the Napoleonic era, which I think is really interesting. And you can tell, by the way, that the Jaeger is very forest coated. Look at that dark, rich green uniform. Again, early forms of camouflage. They would have been very, very useful and very, very prominent during the Napoleonic Wars. I think it's a cool thing to bring up, the Jaegers as a unit in general. The individual on the left, by the way, is the Doso or the Danzo. Now, some people will attribute this to just the Mali tribe, but the Doso and Danzo are actually a fraternal order, a brotherhood of sorts, of essentially just individuals who, much like the Jaegers and the Rangers of medieval history, engaged in bushcraft as a form of survival. However, in the 60s up to the 90s, the Doso and the Danzo were essentially tapped by their respective governments to help with law and order, essentially police actions in places where crime was rampant. Now, here's the interesting thing about this, and by interesting I mean it's going to get a little dicey for a second. There's a lot of research on these guys. Some of them hail the Doso and the Danzo as the kind of lawmen that you would see as someone in like the Wild West, and there are some individuals in the Doso and Danzo groups who do seem like they acted like peacekeepers at a time that it was desperately needed. However, there are some reports that minority ethnic groups had violence inflicted on them by the Dosos or Danzos. It just depends on where you are. That's why the pronunciation varies. But it's interesting for us to think about that, because while the Doso and Danzo do carry on an importance in terms of bushcraft and the proficiency with rifles, it also speaks to some of the issues with arming a lot of your citizenry in ways that make them incredibly deadly. And by the way, it's not just the Doso or the Danzo. I do want to mention this right now, but there are reports that German Jaegers, for example, did engage in extra military attacks on some civilians, and even the Rangers of the Middle Ages, those war bands, the ones that were highly sought after, they were often some of the ones that committed some of the worst atrocities during times of war. We also, by the way, very important thing for us to take into account here, but few people who have actually, heard of Robin Hood, like you've seen the movie, few people forget that Robin Hood starts his life off by unaliving a dude in a drunken rage at a dinner party. That's what sets him off on the run. Again, this speaks to the tradition and potentially the dangers of arming a large group of your populace and expecting them to do what is necessary and right all of the time. Again, it's interesting to think about, but this comes up no matter what group of Rangers you're talking about. Something to just take into account, something to keep in mind. However, I'm also really happy that Pete sponsored this video, because people like Bass Reeves in the American West are a perfect example of the Ranger. For those of you who don't know Bass Reeves was an American lawman and by most accounts one of the most successful U.S. Marshals of all time. But what made Bass Reeves so successful, other than his skill with a firearm, was that he was able to, because of his understanding of the Cherokee language and customs, learn how to survive in the wilderness, and he treated Cherokee territory like it was his home base, something that few other marshals did. It meant that if you were going to send parties of gunslingers out for reprisal on Reeves, you were going to have a rough time doing so, because it was going to be hard for you to get to him. And in fact, a couple people did try this. It did not go well for them. Bass Reeves was him, dude. He was him with a capital H. He even brought his own son to justice when his son went rogue and murdered a man. But yeah, it's incredible. Bass Reeves is the GOAT. But American gunslingers, particularly ones with an understanding of the frontier, do have a good time as a Ranger type archetype. I think that's an important thing to take into account. But with that out of the way, having discussed multiple different interpretations of the Ranger in times that don't count the Middle Ages, how do we use the Ranger in our games? There's a couple things that we can lean on for this, but I've got a couple here. And the first one I want to do is I want to draw attention to the fact that the Ranger isn't somebody who exists in isolation. This is an individual who learns bushcraft, learns it from someone in their family, and passes those abilities on. So I call this just the lineage, but let's start with a single ability. Let's start with something like, I don't know, power shot or whatever, right? It's just 1d8 extra damage on a ranged attack. Nothing to write home about. However, what I think you should do is, if you're playing with this rule set, have the Ranger be able to pass this ability on to the next character in the line. And when this character, eventually passes it on to the next one, each subsequent character gets to add some unique angle to this ability. This would echo the kinds of ways that bushcraft, archery, and the ability to train got better the more generations you are into the Ranger's training process. I think this is a really cool way to draw attention to and perhaps honor the overall importance of a lineage, the importance of that sort of master-apprentice relationship as it pertains to the Ranger. New routes is another ability that I think is pretty important. One of the things that does not get talked about a lot in games is survival and its importance in the wilderness, and a lot of people don't use survival in their games. So instead of making the Ranger somebody who has survival and tracking abilities when you're not going to use them, why not give the Ranger the ability to say, hey, I know a special route, and then the party can either enter combat or, if they need to retreat, combat with some amount of partial or total cover, protecting them from ranged attacks, spells, or other abilities. This could be really interesting, and you could even extend this as a role-playing game ability by the player being like, hey, I know a route into this town. We go through, a hidden pass in a mountain valley. That's what lets us sneak in. I think that's a cool way of doing it. Treat it kind of like not bardic knowledge, because I think that's the wrong way to do it, and I also don't love the way that bardic knowledge is instituted, but treat it like a rumor system where, over time, the Ranger doesn't get to know rumors, but the Ranger does get to find hidden pathways in nature that other individuals might miss. I think that's kind of critical. And of course, you could do beast arrows. Yes, I used this because when I googled beast arrows looking for an image, I thought I was going to find something from like WoW or Pathfinder, something fun. This was the first thing that popped up, and I thought this was adorable. So that's my beast arrow. Everybody, that's Craig. Say hi, Craig. Hi, Craig. But you could, for example, tie the Ranger's love of archery and their love of the wilderness into the beast arrow. So any animal that is slain by the Ranger can then be stored, their spirit, their energy, their essence can be stored in the arrow. And then when you hit someone with the arrow, instead of it doing the normal arrow damage, it will do the damage as if the beast made a successful attack in general. This is a cool way, and it encourages the players to go out and maybe fight characters they normally wouldn't fight, because it lets the Ranger stock up on those animal arrows. It also means that you could have like specialized quivers to hold arrows, like a bear arrow, an eagle arrow, stuff like that. You could really get buck wild with it if you put some magical creatures in your game too, and think about like how they would use abilities. I think all of that is a really cool angle to play around with in terms of the Ranger. And while we're on this topic, and before I end the video, I know the idea of animal companions and a connection to animals is pretty common in Rangers in general. This was one of the things that, despite the fact that it pops up so much, and again, I think it's just because of the proclivity to the wilderness in general, that's why it exists, but it's not something that exists within the historical traditions or the oral traditions that surround this character archetype. That doesn't mean you shouldn't include it in your games, but it does mean that it is something that was later on and embellished upon because of the Ranger's innate connection to the natural world. But with that out of the way, my dear friends, that brings us to the end of our video today. If you liked this, you can, of course, get yourself onto Patreon. $3 a month, you get your name in the credits. $10 a month, you get a game that I make special just for you. Nobody else can get it. You can't even buy it anywhere else. You have to be on the Patreon for that month. Again, if you want digital copies of any of our role-playing games, itch.io is the place to go get those. And if you're a physical person, you want physical copies, why not get them from Tabletop Bookshelf, Indie Press Revolution, and Exalted Funeral. Now, before I thank our amazing patrons, a reminder, if you're a member of the Discord, you are allowed to ask questions for the Q&A section that follows each of the videos proper. So that link is in the description below. For free $59, you too can ask all of your burning questions about the Ranger. So I will be seeing you all in the Q&A section, but first, a massive thank you to Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Aiden Delaney, Brian, Gorbino the Great, Stefan Brosseau, Solution, Alex.vksh, and Papa Dinosaur. Folks, thank you again so much for your support. It means the world to me, and it lets me do the kind of content that I love and I'm proud of. But hopefully I will see all of you for the Q&A section, but if not, I'm Kylot for Desks and Dorks. Y'all are absolutely amazing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Hello, Dad Bod. How we doing, everybody? It's good to see everyone. And welcome back. This is the Q&A section, of course. And yeah, it's just where I talk a little bit. It's not really edited. It's not really, there's not like a big storytelling moment or anything. If you're new to the channel, this is what we do here. You know, a little Q&A at the end of the videos, just to keep things light and fresh. New Polly Dad asks, oh, by the way, you have to be part of the Discord to ask the questions. That's just how it goes. That's my, me business. I do business. All right. New Polydad asks, why does Hunter's Mark completely fail and miss the mark when it comes to core class identity and ability? That's a really great question. There's a couple of good reasons for it. One, it sucks as an ability. Oh, wow, you deal extra damage a little bit. Oh, wow, that's so cool. Like, you can increase the die size. Like, it just... So, I think part of it is, like, gameplay-wise, it's not thematic, it's not interesting, and it also I don't think has anything really to do with the class identity of the Ranger or the archetype, right? Again, like we've talked about this at length, I don't like D&D as a system. I think it's bad, and this is another great example of why, right? Like, it is strictly worse than sneak attack. It's strictly worse than like a fighter with extra bonus damage. It's strictly worse than a lot of things that you could do from a, gameplay perspective, right? But, D&D's not just a gameplay game, right? It's a role-playing game. So what part of Hunter's Mark, like, leads to a strong core identity on the part of the Ranger? And the truth is, none of it really does. Right? Like, I would love if instead of Hunter's Mark, it was like Trick Shot or something, and you could do crazy stuff with the bow and arrow, or if you could, through your immense skill, inspire your party to do a volley of ranged attacks. Like, that would be really cool. I don't know. There's just a number of ways to make it more compelling, I think, in general, than just Hunter's Mark. I think it's not very good as a gameplay ability. It doesn't really go into the core class identities or fantasies. It's just not very engaging. It's not very good. It's pretty weak. There's a lot of reasons I think it's bad. Does Jeremy Crawford have an anti-Ranger bias, or is the class lacking simply a consequence of the class identity getting watered down over time? I'm not super familiar with Jeremy Crawford's work, so I'm just I'll let you know that right now. But I did a little cursory search on him, and some of the arguments that he has for it feel pretty cogent to me. Like, this is an issue. Again, I feel like I shit on D&D all the time, and I don't mean to. But like a lot of the martial classes, like Ranger and Fighter specifically, but like Rogue too, to an extent. I feel like they just get like absolutely just murked by the other ones, and a lot of like Rangers' core identity feels like it's co-opted by other classes, or feels like they just don't know what to do with Ranger in general. And that, I think, is a consequence of the class getting watered down. I think people just don't like some of the things that a Ranger would be good at. Like, I know a lot of players don't love the survivability aspect of like a game world like the Ranger. And so, I think a lot of it is just, I think the class is watered down. I feel like his, the quote unquote, the anti-Ranger bias, as it were, I think is warranted, in some cases. Just my opinion. Mass Bandit is or is not a Ranger a fighter? So, no. And there's a couple ways for this. For your follow-up question, Mass Bandit, which is there a greater difference than one probably lives in a bush with a bow and the other probably doesn't? And I would say it is in the roles they play in society. Like, we established this, right? Like, a Ranger is a member of a community. A Ranger has a service to the community, right? It protects them from predatory animals. It provides food to the community. The Ranger passes their skill on in a way that feels really holistic. As opposed to the fighter, who presumably learns this through formal military training, and their sole purpose is formal military action. And so I think there's a difference both in how they get the skills and the role they play in community. Right? This is one of the things that we talk about a lot, at least I've talked about a lot with some people, because obviously I work in education. There was a push a while ago to like arm teachers, and one of the big like reasons not to do that, I don't think, is when you are carrying a weapon in that space, like, your mindset shifts, right? The fighter is there for a reason. If the fighter shows up, they're there in a spot to carry the weapon for a reason. And the reason is usually to take things out, right? A Ranger's weapon isn't necessarily a weapon so much as it's a tool to provide for the needs of the community and the needs of their family. I think that's a huge difference in terms of that. Yes, the proclivity to the environment, I think, is also a much bigger issue than maybe we're alluding to here, right? It's like, it's not just that they live in the bush with a bow. There's an understanding of the natural world. There's an approach to the natural world. There's the ability to use the natural world to your advantage. There's all kinds of crazy stuff. So I think there's a lot of difference. And I'm kind of here for the difference. I would like for martial classes to have more representation in their core class fantasy than not, I think, is a good way of looking at it. Cadme, since Aragorn is not a Ranger, that's a bold take in the class sense. Who in LOTOR actually is? Okay, first of all, I think Aragorn is a Ranger. Right? Hit and run tactics, sure. Aragorn is arguably as good as most of the elves with a bow. I don't know if that's a hot take or not, but I don't think he's as good as like Elrond or Legolas. Although we never see Elrond with a bow, really. Maybe Elrond's more of a swordsman than he is an archer. That's an interesting concept. No, I think Aragorn is a Ranger. But let's play devil's advocate here for a second, Cadme, because I love this idea. Who would be a Ranger in the event that Aragorn is not a Ranger? And I don't think it's Legolas. Legolas has essentially the equivalent of like formal elven military training. So I think Legolas is a fighter. I think Gimli is a fighter, and we're using fighter not in the D&D terms. I think fighter in D&D terms is pretty weak too, but I think both Legolas and Gimli are formal soldiers, soldiers with formal military training, a formal military rank, formal military responsibilities, right? It's got to be Merry or Pippin, I think, right? I think it is Merry or Pippin. It checks out all the boxes except for maybe the ranged attacks. But they're hobbits, so they use the throwing stones. No, I think Merry or Pippin, right? They spend time with the Ents, so massive connection to nature, check. Still duking it out, hit and run style tactics. I think it's Merry or Pippin. That's gonna be my flag in the ground there, Cadme. That's a really interesting one. Cadme, I feel like you ask these questions and then I consider them for days after I do the Q&A. So we'll see. Ripley, you have a couple. Oh, good, Ripley. I hope we have a couple answers. What do you think of the common divide between the Ranger in RPGs, both tabletop and video, being an archery class, when the kind of archetypal Ranger is Aragorn, a melee-focused character? So I think, here's the thing. I think Aragorn isn't just a melee-focused character. I think Aragorn is a character who, okay, so we're going to get deep into the weeds for a second here, Ripley. But part of the reason Aragorn's focus is on the sword is the sword is essentially a Trojan horse of a storytelling device. So, and Tolkien would have known this because Tolkien was a medievalist, but there was several traditions, particularly in Anglo-Saxon cultures, where a sword wasn't just a sword. A sword is an extension of a person's will and an extension of a person's ability to make their way in life. So when chattel slavery was common, one of the ways that you would free a thrall or free an enslaved person, a signifier that you were free, was a sword, right? And so in many ways, as like a literary analysis, Aragorn repairing the sword of Gondor isn't just Aragorn repairing a sword, it's Aragorn repairing and rebuilding the will of mankind to resist evil, and his not just his rejection of evil in general, but his reforging of the blade is, in a literary sense, Tolkien saying mankind has now freed itself from evil. And so I think there's a greater focus on the sword, not because Aragorn necessarily is a sword-focused ranger, but because in like a literary sense, it carries over the core themes of the story really well. It's kind of an important little metatextual analysis there. Oh, there are fireworks going off near my house. Apparently we're very, very excited tonight. But I think that's why. And the movies, I think, do this actually much better than the books. I'll be completely honest. I'm about to commit sacrilege here. I don't love the books necessarily, but I think the films do a much better job of representing some of the characters and core concepts. Sorry, everybody. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, my apologies. But I think the films do a really good job of displaying that Aragorn is as much a hunter and a tracker as he is a swordsman. So I think that's kind of a core thing. 2, do you think the Ranger archetype is best suited in combat as A, support unit harrying damage and buffs to allies, a striker unit doing high single target damage, a control unit doing debuffing and creating areas of difficult terrain and possibly covering fire? I have my own thoughts on this. But I want to know yours. I think it depends on the type of game. So now we're going from the literary analysis to the game design stuff. If it also depends on like what part of the core fantasy you are doing for the Ranger archetype, right? If you are doing something like World of Warcraft, which I played and I loved, I love the Ranger as DPS. I think that's like their bread and butter in a video game sense, right? I think there's something really gratifying about spamming a ton of arrows and letting the chips fall where they may. In terms of a role-playing game setting, and I don't know if this is like the thing I think it's best suited for, so much as it's the angle I wish more tabletop designers explored. I would love to see the Ranger as a support class being explored more. And I don't mean that in the traditional like buff debuff sense. I would really love a class that leans into, like, you could keep the single target damage, but I would really love the Ranger's skills and abilities to apply to getting to places, getting out of places, discovering new locations, and engaging with that both pre-combat, post-combat, and in role-playing. It's part of the reason I have frozen, by the way, on the new routes part of the video, because it's something that I really thought was interesting. It's a good take, I think, on Ranger in general. One of the games that I think does this really well is not actually a role-playing game. It's a game called Set a Watch, which is a tabletop just board game. And in that game, you travel to locations, and the locations determine the amount of monsters that you have to fight, as well as having abilities that either help or hurt your party. And the Ranger class, one of the things that it does is it allows you to manipulate the location deck and share that information with the other people at the table. It's really small, but I love that impact of like translating the connection to the environment and the ability to survive into something like that. I think is an angle that is not explored or done enough, at least for me to be like particularly thrilled, shall we say. All right. As the Ranger is closely associated with the bow and arrow, what other weapons do you think it suits it best? I mean, obviously, if we're going with a, Western European interpretation of it, then yeah, I think it's the bow and arrow. But, you could easily, we talked about like the Wild West gunslinger Ranger. We talked about the colonial frontiersman. Obviously, they would have used a musket. The Jaeger also would have used a musket, the Dozo or Donzo. Again, so it's interesting because we're in Africa in the 1960s through 80s. So you have a lot of like essentially World War I era surplus weaponry being used at that time, particularly in Côte d'Ivoire, which is where some of the Dozo and Danzo were stationed. So that's really interesting. But they did use muskets or like bolt action rifles, which were interesting too. I think, however, if I'm going to go with an unconventional weapon, it would be really interesting to make like a antiquity inspired game, because you could use things like the sling, like the Balearic slingers of Rhodes would have used. Or, sorry, not of Rhodes. There are Rhodian slingers, but the Balearic slingers were from the Balearic Islands in the Mediterranean Sea. And they were essentially shepherds, but they were very equipped and adroit with using slings to protect their flocks of sheep. That's a really cool angle. Like, using a sling as a weapon is hard. I think that's really sweet. I would do that. And then many of the indigenous peoples of the Americas had a special throwing spear, and essentially it was like a wooden handle that you would attach to the end of the spear for more fulcrum and more leverage, so you could throw the spear longer, faster, harder. I think it's cool. Insert Daft Punk beat drop there. What are some historical figures? Oh, sorry. Man, you have a lot of questions, Ripley. I love this. You're asking good ones, though. We're going in hard, bro. The Ranger is often seen as a stealthy class. How would you design for that space without compromising the space of classes like rogues and thieves who rely on stealth? That's a good question. I think part of it is that you have to understand that there's probably going to be some overlap, but you can let them do the same thing, but seeking different results. This is part of the reason why I think a support ranger is more interesting, because getting access to more points of ingress and egress, or, being able to roleplay discovering new locations and ways in and out of existing locations is an unexplored game space. I think that's kind of cool. That's what I would do. That's how I would design it. What are some historical characters you would consider to be rangers? Obviously, we talked about Robin Hood already. We did talk about Bass Reeves. I think Bass Reeves would be a good ranger. Not all cowboys would be good rangers. Bass Reeves would be a good one. McGeel, I see your question, and I'm just going to co-opt it really quick. Jim Corbett is a fantastic ranger. If you don't know who Jim Corbett is, I would highly encourage you to read the book Man-Eaters of Kumaon, which is a fantastic text. It is about Jim Corbett, who is the son of a nationalized governor in India. He becomes a big game hunter, partially because he is a skilled marksman and a skilled hunter, but mostly as you read the text, you realize that he's just fiercely lonely. He's not British enough for his fellow Brits because he was born in India to British parents. Obviously, his dad was a provisional governor of one of the territories there, and he's not Indian enough to fit in with the people of India, and so he seeks solace and a sense of belonging and meaning in the wilderness. He's actually credited with eliminating the most dangerous man-eating tiger of all time, the Champawat man-eater, who devoured anywhere from like the conservative estimates are like in the like low hundreds to like 500, 600 people, which is crazy. It was a female tiger who had an impacted tooth brought on by an injury that was dealt to her from a poacher. And that's usually what happens with large predatory animals, is they get injured and that's when they start preying on humans. So yeah, Jim Corbett is the GOAT. I think, Jim Corbett's great. Man-Eaters of Kumaon is great. It's a great book. And last question, 6. Oh no, never mind. Bonus 7. Okay. 6. The Ranger often feels like the only class built around the exploration pillar of play in many TTRPGs. What would you do to encourage other classes to engage in this area of play? I'm going to be smug for like 2 seconds. I'd play a different game. I don't think D&D does enough with travel, with survival, with the wilderness to make it possible. You can homebrew it. Obviously, that's everyone's answer anytime I bring up any of the flaws of D&D as a system. Just homebrew it. But like, cool, but also, maybe this system should try to explore some new space. That being said, that's the smug answer. But the real answer, I think, truthfully, is you need to make exploration core to the dual pillars of why we play role-playing games, right? Like, there has to either be a compelling gameplay reason to make exploration important. And I don't mean negative reinforcement either. I don't mean like, we lose hit points if we don't do this right. Gloomhaven does this really well. There are road events. So like in between missions of dungeon crawling, you will encounter role-playing stuff in the form of like choose your own adventure cards. And it's a really like simple system, but it's a really fun system. And so there are classes that have So part of like what makes it compelling is depending on the class you play in Gloomhaven, when you pull a card from the system, it like you will sometimes unlock special options or dialogue based on what character you're playing. So like there might be dialogue that you wouldn't normally get or options you could select if you're a different character. I think something along those lines, Ripley, is probably the best way to allow that. And you can bake that into your campaign writing, or if you're not a planner, if you're not a prepper like I am, I don't prep for any of the games that I run ever. One of the things that I do is like, I'm absolutely willing to adapt on the fly. I often tell my players, convince me. Tell me why you think you should be able to do this one thing based on your backstory, based on your abilities, based on the skills your character has. And so, if a fighter being like, hey, we're passing through an area that produces arms and armor, I should be able to interact with this. That's critical. I think that's a cool way of doing it. So bonus, 7 favorite Rangers in fiction. Mine is Katniss Everdeen. That's a great choice. Katniss is a great choice. Hunger Games is a great choice just in general. I think Hunger Games is like one of the best book series I've ever read. It's very compelling and feels more and more prescient every day that I'm alive, which I don't think I love very much. With that being said, though, my favorite Rangers in fiction, I am still partial to Drizzt Do'Urden, or Do'Urden. I forget how you pronounce Drizzt's last name. But I didn't love R.A. Salvador's later books, but the Dark Elf trilogy I think still holds out, and I'm aware the Dark Elf trilogy technically comes after some of his later books when the Drizzt character started to pick up a lot in popularity. But Dark Elf trilogy is like as a contained 3 set of novels is just based. It's so good. It is literally just a philosophy text disguised as a fantasy story, which I dig. I dig it a lot. Yeah, we'll just go with Drizzt right now, just because I'm blanking on some other ones. Jim Corbett might be my favorite example of a real life ranger, though. I know Aragorn is. I feel like Aragorn's everybody's favorite ranger, and he should be, because he's the GOAT. I love Aragorn. All right, let's do this. McGill, who are some historical people we can draw inspiration from to be better / more interesting rangers? I just mentioned Jim Corbett, and McGill. Thank you for bringing up this question. But yeah, I think Jim Corbett's like the ultimate ranger. I love that man to death. But any real bushcraft enthusiast, I think, could be an interesting one. There is perhaps a fair case to be made that Ted Kelly of Australian fame is a ranger, although I don't know if that's true or not. Is Lyudmila Pavlichenko a ranger or a gunslinger? I would argue neither. I don't think Lyudmila has the natural world tendency that a ranger does, and I don't think gunslinging is what she would do. If I was going to say, I would make something like sharpshooter, perhaps, or Deadeye for somebody like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who is arguably the GOAT. Her and Simo Haya walk into a room. I don't know who's coming out on top. That's a tough one. Man, I love Lyudmila. Oh my god. And not a ranger related thing, McGill, but her response to the question, how many men have you taken care of, and she gives the answer, but then she goes, not men, fascists, and fascists aren't men. I'm like, that's awesome. Oh yeah, they build them different over in the Soviet Union, man. I tell you what, that's a woo. Yeah, I'm glad she was on our side. That was good. Balalaika asks, with Rangers' whole thing about being really good at navigation, having favorite enemies, and being self-sufficient combatants in difficult environments, could one say that as a concept, they're the closest we commonly have in fantasy to our modern understanding of special forces? And if yes, are there any historical examples of such formations being employed before the modern era? That is a really good question. So, to answer part 1, do I think the Ranger is special forces? And I would say, like, there's not a good one-to-one correlation, right? Because I think the use of firearms in general sort of deflates Balalaika any real fantasy comparison. If anything, I think a special forces member would be closer to like a fighter of some kind, right? Specialized military training for a formal purpose. And this is something that I think like the TV show Burn Notice covered, which I thought was really interesting. But like your average commando is really good at prepping for something, but they're not necessarily always good at being ready for being ready on the fly in the way that a ranger would. So I think like a frontiersman is probably a better use of a ranger. Like Daniel Boone is a good example of a ranger, or the vaqueros, who are Spanish cowboys, the people who would actually inspire much of like modern cowboy fashion and trends, or much of like the dime store western. The vaquero is like part of that for sure. However, to answer your other question, there are historical examples of special forces. One of the ones that I think of a lot is one of King John's castles, I believe, was besieged unsuccessfully until an elite strike force of knights literally went up the poop chute, for lack of a better term, of the latrine that the king used in the chapel of the castle. So they literally at night scaled the walls, or scaled the cliffside, ascended up through the chute, up through the toilet, took care of any sentries that they found, and opened the castle doors. So that's like just one example. The other one too, like even ancient Greece, for example, has wonderful examples of this. The story The Warriors, if you've ever watched The Warriors Come Out to Play, right, that one, is actually a modern interpretation of a Greek myth. And not myth, but it is a Greek myth. It's an apocryphal story about a group of like 500 mercenaries who are stranded in Persia, and they're essentially like the Greek. I don't know if they're Greek or they're Seleucid or they're Ptolemaic, but they're not anglicized, Hellenized. They're a Hellenistic force, and they essentially cut a swath from Persia all the way back home to Greece. So there are definitely like what I would consider special forces in the Middle Ages and in antiquity. But I don't know. I don't necessarily think the Ranger is that one, although they could be. Trackers being what they are and being necessary and needed. Who knows? I think you could say yes to having some on the team. I don't think it's completely apt to say that every one of them would be a Ranger. I feel like a soldier, professional soldier, is probably a better one-to-one. T-Sizzle, or T-Stizzle, I should say. I keep doing the Taylor Swift thing, man. I'm so sorry. Whenever I hear the term Ranger, I think of it in military terms, meaning light infantry, able to perform scouting, raiding, and direct action missions. Is there a medieval equivalent to this? And furthermore, does this feel like more of what the core concept should be about? That's interesting. So, yes, there's a medieval equivalent to this. I mean, the medieval archer in many ways did that, right? Light scouts did that all the time. And also T-Stizzle, to that point, right? Remember, the Middle Ages were carried out by warband actions. So in many ways, all of your warbands were doing this in some way, shape, or form, particularly in like smaller scale conflicts. That being said, though, your assertion that maybe the Rangers should not be focused on survival at all, but should be focused specifically on reconnaissance and troop direction is an interesting one. Inside you are two Rangers, and one of them wants to do nature and survival, and the other one is about reconnaissance and troop direction. I don't actually know the answer to that, T-Stizzle. I'm going to have to percolate on that one. That's a really interesting idea, conceptually. I like what you're cooking up. Cross. I don't know why I paused there. I'm so sorry, Cross. Were there Rangers who worked for anyone other than the nobility? Yes. If so, who else hired them? It's a great question. So again, we established like the Ranger exists primarily as a communal unit, right? A community unit. And so they worked for themselves in a lot of cases, or they worked for the remnants of their government. Like if you're a Welsh freedom fighter, you would have done that. That being said, though, one of the things that I mentioned in one of the text pop-ups on the video was that the warbands of archers, who would later go on to do a lot of important work, and by important work I mean important fighting, in Flanders and in Italy. So it's not just the nobility, but like city councils, city governments probably would have afforded or bought some of those mercenary companies. That's definitely another potential occupier and employer for those. Lithrandel, number 2. Does the Ranger even fit into modern heroic fantasy archetypes? Yeah, I would argue they do. I think there's something to be said about a common person with uncommon skills stepping into a world like that. And, something about the natural ability and strength of someone going out there, I think it does make a ton of sense. I would argue it does. While they made sense in ORS, old school D&D, and other low fantasy settings where wilderness is dangerous, navigation is important, the way of the dungeon at times is just as lethal as the dungeon itself, does it still do so in a heroic genre such as Pathfinder 2e, D&D 4e, where travel is a mere formality, resources are not tracked as closely, and navigation is disregarded in favor of allowing players to find the interesting things quickly? I would say yes, Lithrindle, and I will say yes, not necessarily because I think D&D does a good job of making those important distinctions. It doesn't, right? I've already said that a couple times, but I think it falls on us as game designers, as game masters, to find a way to make it so that it works. There is something so appealing to the Ranger, I think, as a heroic one, because as I mentioned, this feels like, in many ways, a response of a community and its teachings and its skills to continue on and make a life for themselves in spite of, or perhaps despite, the things that are going on around them that are fantastic or heroic, right, to use your terminology. That's one of the things that I think matters. And I think if we lose the Ranger, or the Ranger archetype, right, because again, this is not always a D&D channel. I don't want to, we're talking about role-playing games at large. If we lose that archetype, I think we lose something that feels naturally heroic in a way that is really down to earth for the common man. And so I think that's a really good way to approach it. That would be my recommendation. I think that's what I would say. So I would say, yes, it fits. I don't think let me TLDR it for you. I don't think the Ranger is the problem. I think the game system is the issue. The Ranger as an archetype works perfectly for fantasy role-playing, heroic role-playing as well. The system itself does not find ways to allow this character to shine, and that is a fault of the system, not the archetype. We'll go with that. And last question. Alien Dragon XLII. I will say that like Zerg every time. Why do you think the Ranger has such a notorious identity crisis in the modern RPG landscape? This could just be my 5e heavy background showing, but it seems like quite the elephant in the room for Rangers. I'm going to do my best, Alien, to break this down in a couple ways. I think Lithrindle actually brought up one of the biggest issues, which is that in older editions of D&D, travel to the dungeon, from the dungeon, around the dungeon, was as dangerous as the dungeon itself. And the Ranger, having a competent Ranger, was a important stopgap in making sure that you didn't get murked prior to doing that. Navigation was dangerous. Traversal was dangerous. And having the Ranger be a part of your party made it so that you had not a get-out-of-jail-free card, but a fighting chance against the world. Losing access to that means that you lose one angle of approach and nuance for that character. That's part of it. The other part is, and this is not just true for the Ranger, but it's true for basically all of the martial classes in D&D, the design team does not seem to know how to give martial classes the abilities needed to compete with their magic brethren, right? If you think about like a game of 5e as a Swiss Army knife, even at lower levels, a spellcaster is going to have infinitely more options to approach a problem than someone like a fighter or a ranger. So like when I did the D&D is a broken system video a while ago, I pointed this out, but like it's such a glaring flaw. Like think about, and it's not just what I pointed out in that video. Let me walk this back a second. What I pointed out in that video was the idea that like at like first level, you have access to, as like a wizard or a sorcerer, you have access to like 30 some spells, 20 some spells. And then let's say you can cast, 6 of them, 6 out of the 20, right? The issue isn't just that you had 20 options to like the Rangers 2. The issue is now that you have 6 of those 20 options, you have 6 different ways outside of skills and class abilities to approach a problem that the Ranger doesn't. Now, I'm aware that the Ranger does get spells later on, but I don't think this fixes the problem because, again, you're always going to have less options than the more spell-oriented character. I think that's part of it. The other part is, as time goes on, elements of the Ranger's class identity keep getting co-opted by other classes, right? As Ripley pointed out earlier, the stealth angle is often seen as the rogue part, or the thief part, right? The nature angle is often seen as the druid part. The being a fighter who occupies this sort of savage, wild space is often seen as the barbarian part of the class. So it's tough, I think, for the Ranger to keep that core class identity in the same way that the fighter keeps losing elements of itself to the barbarian, the paladin, and ultimately to the Ranger a little bit too, right? I think that also matters. So partially it is those things, right? I also think that, as we mentioned before for Lithrandel's question, D&D doesn't do a great job of providing opportunities to roleplay a fantasy anymore. This was not something I touched on in that original video, but like D&D, well, maybe it was. D&D's a great sandbox, right? It's like one of its biggest strengths. It's a sandbox. In general, it's an amusement park without a theme. It's like the county fair. You go and you can engage with everything. You can go get some funnel cake, go to the dunk tank. Like, there's all kinds of cool stuff. And again, I don't mean to sound like I'm like, shitting on D&D, because I don't think that's a productive or a conducive use of our time. You know what I mean? Like, as designers, I think we should look at what it's doing right and doing wrong, because I think it's really helpful. But D&D is the county fair. There's no specific theme really, but there's a bunch of different ways that you can engage with it, and with those fantasies, right? But there's not anything specific in the rules for you to really hang your hat on in role-playing, right? One of the things that I love about a great system that I've been looking at to try for a little bit was like Ranger of the Borderlands. It was a 2d20 system from Modiphius, but the whole thing is that you are on the edges of civilization trying to stop the evil from encroaching, but because you're on the edges of civilization, nobody really believes you. Or Gravemire, which is a fantastic role-playing game that's set in like an ever-expanding eldritch bayou, basically. Everyone's kind of a ranger because the environment is really dangerous in ways that are really difficult for you to deal with and approach. Those systems are far less appealing because they're far more specific, right? That's the weakness of those systems. They're not the county fair. They're like, the haunted house and also tarot reading, wax candle in a skull shop, right? It's only going to appeal to a very specific subsection of people, but because it has a very specific direction, those systems lend to more evocative role-playing if you're willing to engage with that system at face value. And so I think a lot of D&D's systems aren't really geared towards that kind of role-playing. And while the general approach of the amusement park style world has a lot of good trade-offs, I think ultimately it can leave some classes like the Ranger, for example, out in the cold. That was a really long diatribe. I hope that made some sense. I feel like it did. I feel like that was cogent. But in any case, that's what I'm thinking about. So, and with that, my friends, that is the end of the questions. A long Q&A today, but you know what? It was a good Q&A. I'm really grateful to everybody for asking good questions, and I really appreciate it. So, thank you all so much. You guys are great. I talked about this before. Y'all are awesome, and I think it's sweet to have y'all around. I really appreciate it. Going to be some announcements coming out soon. I will be, I think, taking not a break, but I'm looking at how we approach some of the content, because this video I like, but a lot of the last couple videos I've not been as satisfied with the quality of them, and I don't know if that's just a me thing, being like, no, I think I can make better stuff, or if it's just or if they're actually dipping. So there's a lot going on, but just in general, as always, your presence as part of the Dad Bod, those of you who are around and watching, even if you're not asking questions, even if you're just watching, it means a lot. So with that being said, Kyle out for Desks and Dorks. Y'all are great. We love you. We love you. And we'll see you in the next one. Peace.